Hello and welcome to Asaaba, a podcast that honors oral tradition and shines light on Ghanaian stories that are often untold or silenced. I'm your host, Michelle, and my pronouns are she and her. Hey everyone! I hope everyone is doing well. I'm glad to be back for another episode. So this episode will be an interview episode. I know I've been kind of switching it up between solo and interview this season, and I've really been enjoying that, because the solo episodes, I feel like you get to know me a little bit more, and also I get to do either research-based or kind of reflective episodes, which I really have been wanting to tap into this season and moving forward as well. So yeah, this episode in particular will be an interview episode. But before we get into that, I just want to thank everyone who's been supporting the podcast, everyone who has been, sharing it and supporting, whether it's via donations or just by telling people about it, retweeting it, etc. on social media, I just really appreciate it, and I get really happy when I see that, because I'm like, yay, I appreciate you guys' support. And speaking of support, there are two ways to support the podcast. And the first way is by sharing. So Asaaba is on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at asasebapod. And there are multiple ways to support, whether it's social media or elsewhere. So you can retweet episodes on Twitter, post on your Insta stories, share on WhatsApp, tell your family, friends to listen, and also engaging. I would really love to see if something resonates with you, if you have a comment or a thought about a specific episode. I'd love to see you, write about it on social media and use the hashtag asasebapod. So that's ASASEBAPOD. Yeah, just so that I can see it and others can see it as well. And another way that you can support is via monetary donations. So right now, currently, hopefully not in the future, but currently, I'm the sole producer, editor, planner, interviewer, designer, doer of all the things. There's no team or conglomerate behind me. So I love doing this work, but it's also work. It's also labor, right? So if you want to support me as an indie creator, you can donate via email transfer if you're a Canada resident. If you're outside of Canada, you can donate via PayPal. And the email for the e-transfer and PayPal is asasebapod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. All right, so let's jump into this week's episode. So today's episode, Asaaba joins me. And Asaaba pronouns she and her, is a history lover, occasional 3D artist, and feminist. She enjoys learning new things about her heritage, Ghanaian history, and about the many cultures of Ghana. Asaaba spends her free time tweeting about everything and nothing and dreaming of her next 3D piece. I am so excited for this episode because I love learning about history. I love aesthetics and style and vintage aesthetics. I remember from early on searching that, back in the Tumblr days, I used to search for vintage Ghanaian aesthetics, and Asaaba does all of that on her Pinterest. And, she does a lot of curation work on this as well. And I was really, really excited to speak with her because we've been following each other on Twitter for a while. But anyways, on this particular episode, Asaaba talks to me about Ghana fashion, hair, and style from the 1800s to present, the colonial origins of the kaba and slit, and how we made it our own, and also her work as a 3D artist, and much, much more. So very exciting stuff. Let's jump into this episode. All right. So today I have Asaaba with me. Asaaba, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Asaaba, and I live in Canada. I'm from Ghana. I'm Ghan, and yeah, I love history, and I do 3D art, and I'm very happy to be here on the podcast.
Yes, and I'm so happy to have you here. I've been following you for a bit on Twitter, and I'm always so in awe at like the curation work that you do. I think that's how I found you on Twitter when you made this Twitter thread about historical hairstyles and the kaba and slits. And I'm like, oh my God, I gotta follow this person.
Oh, that was so sweet. Yes, yes, I actually remember very well. Yeah, that's when you followed me, and then I got to know about your podcast as well. So there you go. Worked out very
Awesome.
well. hmm
Yeah.
Thank
So, how
you.
did you get started with curating periods in Ghana's history?
Okay, so it all started with pretty much curiosity about how our ancestors lived, how they dressed, just how they actually looked in general. I did um, some history in high school, and I always wanted to put faces to our people in every decade. And because I'm a very visual person, um, and I was always curious about, how they dressed, how they made or manipulated their hair. And I'm using that word for a reason. What kind of makeup they used, things like that. A part of their dressing was inspired by the colonialists, and which parts did they hold on to for themselves to still maintain their identity. And unfortunately, because of most of my sources were from like Basel missionary archives and things. And I wouldn't, and I'll just come across a few on Pinterest. I still have many questions about what inspired like their style for each
Mhm.
decade, but it was always interesting to actually see the evolution of it all when I did find some images.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. So, you've always had a passion for history, right? And
Yeah,
it sounds like I guess, logical step to merge your love for history and also visual culture, I guess, into this
yeah,
kind of Pinterest curation and Twitter curation.
exactly. Yeah, bring
So,
it to a digital, place.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So, what subjects do you focus on within your curation work, and why do you choose those subjects to focus on?
Okay. So for now, I tend to focus on mode of dress, mostly because that's what I actually tend to see more of when I look up images. So it was my initial curiosity, and then it was steered by what actually was finding. So, but when it comes to more detailed information on how people actually lived, the more reliable sources, I guess, would be like actual texts or like academic texts, some of which are, much older, some of which are not too accessible, but that's mostly why I focus on more of the dress and the visuals that we do have. And I happen, like I said, I'm a very visual person, so that was the most comfortable kind of research I could do. And it's very nice to put a face to how people adorned themselves and just how they looked overall.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so cool. Like when I was browsing through your Pinterest and also like your
Mhm.
Twitter curation
Yeah.
threads, just seeing images from the 1800s. I typically wouldn't think that that is as accessible,
Mm,
within Ghana and our kind of history, because we're more of an oral history culture.
exactly.
So before we weren't documenting as much, at least, ourselves.
Mm, yep. Mm-hmm.
So that brings me to
Yeah.
my next question.
Right.
So you mentioned that majority of your images, the sources come from missionaries or at least archives. And within the
Mhm.
archives, it's noted that the pictures were taken by missionaries and essentially like colonialists and all of that stuff. And then
Exactly.
a smaller portion of the work that you curate and the photos you curate is from Ghanaian photographers. And I noticed that's like from
Mhm.
50s onward. Have you noticed any differences between those images?
Yes, definitely. So, I'll start from, let's say, the more like the older ones from about the mid 1800s. So, of course, because of I think the way the missionaries were curating, I suppose they wanted to exhibit, the work they do and their surroundings. So it wasn't the people felt more like subjects as opposed to participants, if I should put it that way. So, generally, and I think the general style anyway was, the unsmiling, very still kind of poses. And because of the nature of photography back then, I would see some family portraits of gold coasters, so like the wealthier ones or the royals. You'd see some missionaries living with, like with their domestic staff who are all gold coasters, and they'd have about maybe, let's say, eight of them at a point, and you see them standing there, and maybe the wife family will be seated. Those were some of the things I was seeing. The missionaries supervising work, and then I'd start to see more of the actual Gold Coaster, like the religious ones. So let's say the catechists, as they call them, the priests and their families in European dress, and then a lot of non-Christians in traditional cloth, women with their hair in the individual braids, but then those were still kind of, let me just say, conspicuously hidden. So they were still hidden in the scarves, but you could tell that there was a very prominent hairdo underneath it. And I found that very interesting. I remember there was an image of both a white female teacher and then a Ghanaian or Gold Coaster female teacher, both in a class teaching. And the European woman she was wearing the usual garb of the time, maybe late 1800s, with her hair showing. But then the Gold Coaster teacher had her hair covered, and she also had and we'll get to the kaba in so it was the very old style kaba, inspired by the actual European dress with the very long wide skirt, and she still had a cloth on her and her hair covered. So it was very interesting to see that they're almost in, let me just say, an almost equal capacity, but then she still had to dress a very specific way. I don't know if it was by choice or, if they had to do it that way. So that was something I definitely noticed. And then as we come to the turn of the century, from early 1900s, let's say, up to about the 1940s, then I started to see more imagery from Bruce Van der Poy, who owned Dio Gratias, one of the oldest photo studios in Ghana, actually. And I actually visited when I went home in 2019. It's still run by as a almost like a tourist site by his granddaughter, Mrs. Samako. Just beautiful imagery, and he tend to focus more on the Accra elite and some social life. You'd see, gentlemen, educated gentlemen playing tennis, and like a wedding, and everyone is wearing the 1920s European dress, like the flapper dresses and things like that. The men are in their suits with their hat. So that I
Mhm.
started to see more of that. So I really saw that change. Oh, and just to go back a step, so some of the other images I would see before we even got into the 1900s was, even early 1900s, you'd see the ladies with their, like I said, the big skirts and then the frilly blouse, the big blouses, all loose fitting. And then they'd have the beautiful up to the tekua with the
Mhm.
gold, and they'd have their hands and even toes adorned with jewelry and everything. And they were more Christian women with some, let me say, coastal elite women. So it was almost progressive. I was seeing the change of how the images would come across, where it's like, okay, these are people who are, these are the people we've converted, as opposed to, okay, these are people who are proud of themselves now. This is they're a big part of the fabric of the country at the time. And then, so now I'm coming back to Bruce Vanderpool. Sorry about that.
No
And
worries.
then, all right, and it was showing more cosmopolitan Accra back then, right? And then we go into, let's say, late 50s. Definitely a good chunk of the 60s. We have James Barnor, who is widely recognized, and I'm so happy that we're seeing more recognition for his work. He captured more everyday, very modern post-independence Ghanaians and the budding multiculturalism of the UK. So Ghanaians living in the UK, early gold, or let me say late Gold Coasters, because he did start. Or we have images from the 50s. We have Muhammad Ali, images that he took of him when he came to Ghana and things like that. So we're seeing a very vibrant life, everyday life where there's more, I could feel more joy in the images. And he even took fashion editorials for Drum magazine. So you see women embracing their beauty, and then we have Felicia Abban, who's the first female Ghanaian photographer. She was I would say a contemporary of James Barnor. She was taught by her father, and she happened to be one of Nkrumah's photographers. And most of her portraits absolutely beautiful, mostly higher class women and families. They have their gold and their intuma or mama, as we would say in Ghana, with the tekwa, and some who are dressed very modern, like maybe someone who could maybe just flew in from the UK, so very, very modern imagery of people who are very, like I said, had the dignity and were very proud of themselves. Yeah.
That's
So
so
I noticed
interesting.
that exactly. Yes, I did notice that shift. And again, it's just mostly what I have access to. I fully recognize that some of these were people who actually had the privilege to go to studios and take these pictures. So there's still a lot of regular people who may not have been represented in those images, but that's definitely what I have access to and what I did find.
Yeah, like when you were talking about it, I actually started thinking of that in terms of like who
Hmm.
are the people that are being captured, even
Right.
when we get to a time where Ghanaian photographers are the ones doing the
Mhm.
capturing and all of that. The people, the subjects,
Yep.
as you mentioned, are people that are more elite, that are
Mm.
richer. So it just makes me wonder, what are we missing in terms of our visual imagery of Ghana and Gold Coast,
Yeah.
because
Definitely.
they're taking pictures of the elite rich people,
Hmm.
so there's an element of classism there. But it's
Exactly.
interesting. Thanks for
Yep.
going over, I guess, the differences between the
Hmm.
colonialists and the missionaries, how they took the pictures versus Ghanaian photographers. That's definitely
For
interesting.
sure.
So, what are some of the challenges and the gaps within the historical photos that you curate? And I guess you touched on it a bit
Mhm.
with like, the elitism, the classism. But are
Definitely.
there any other challenges or gaps that you've noticed?
Um, Definitely. So there are images that there's so many that are not digital, or let's just say accessible on digital archives or already uploaded by fellow history lovers. So there's so many, like I said, that we don't have. There's so many that literally are left to the imagination. But then I noticed that like there was a point when I was looking for images from World War II, because we had my grandpa fought in Burma in World War II. So I'm thinking, okay, he was away. How was life for the those who stayed behind? Those who were actually on the ground. I know I saw very few images of like American GIs, some, a few of the Gold Coaster soldiers who fought with them. So I realized that there aren't too many images of that era. So I don't know if it was intentional or they're all under, let's say, Getty Images, which isn't very accessible. Because I remember I used to try to find a few on there, but there were very, very few for that period. So that's just an example of a literal gap where it's like, okay, there's nothing. And meanwhile, I could find, let's say, the ones from the late 1800s where you have the ladies with their beautiful loose clothing with their hair with the gold adorned, and they have the hair in braids and things like that, or let me say individual braids. Those ones I there were times I was even finding duplicates because there was just so many out there. So it really depends. I can't quite put my finger on why it happens, and like I said, not much of everyday life when it comes to those I was able to find. Yeah, so that's a very huge gap.
Yeah, that's interesting. So even I
Mm.
guess the monumental times within Ghanaian and Gold Coast history it's difficult to find images for that.
That's right. Yeah. And then
Okay.
again, I'm just one person, so that's just my personal research. It could be completely different for others. There are people who actually have access to, some kind of archives. So let's say newspaper archives, the actual archives in Accra. So mm, you never know. There may be so much more. And another unlikely source, not so unlikely, another source would even be families. Just what they have been able to curate on by themselves, right? So maybe because people are pretty private, they want to keep their pictures to themselves and not put them out there. So that's probably part of why there isn't so much out there.
Yeah. And
Mm.
I know pre-interview you mentioned that a lot of the images are from the south of Ghana. So is
That's
that another kind of gap or challenge that you see when trying to curate and draw a picture of Ghana back in the day?
definitely a huge chunk of them were either centered literally on the city of Accra or at least on the coast. So you'd have like the Fanti, and then Morgan, let's just say, covering that entire coastal area. Anything when it came to the actual hinterland. So let's say a bit of eastern region, a few of those. And I actually did find very few of the north. But that's the thing, you're right. There are not that many out there that are actually of let's say fully representing the country at the time. So it's very, very, very heavily centered on the south,
Do
specifically
you
the coastal
mhm.
area and Accra.
And do you have any reason why? Like, could you guess why that is?
Yeah. Right off the top of my head, it could just be where everything just happened to be concentrated and what kind of images people were really interested in putting out. I think there was this, you know what? That's really all I can think of. That maybe, okay, I live in Accra. This is my modern city. This is how I want to be portrayed. This is what I want to put out there. So this is what I'll focus on. So it just
Mhm.
really could be that, probably as simple as that. But I cannot quite put my finger on that. Yeah, that's a very valid point. Why certain areas where had the focus. It could even be the history part of it too, where maybe first contact, right, and then how they progress, and then I guess further trying to go further and further into the country. So I guess it
Mhm.
kind of represented, okay, these are our people. They're used to us. They've accepted us. Where this is proof of that. So let's say more on the missionary side, for example, they're showing their work that they've done, converting people and building churches and things like that. So they would definitely show more imagery of that for Mr. Barnor. Maybe, like I said, he's from Accra. He's a Ghana person. He's showing his life in Accra, and the UK. So sometimes it could be just where they're geographically placed or their interest. Yeah.
Mhm. And you're a Ghana woman, so I know you've seen and you've curated, as you mentioned, images from the region and stuff. So,
Mhm.
is there anything that you've personally learned about Ghana culture based on your curation work?
Funny enough, no. So not much when it comes to imagery. Many images were focused on missionary work and city life, working class and elite people. But then, so there wasn't much about actual Ghana culture, but there were different types of Ghana people where let me say, for example, the Christians with Danish and British last names, those who are descended from European missionaries or merchants, right? I did see a couple of images of like I think a Jamestown chief, Jamestown Queen Mother, so very few. There was even a beautiful one of a fisherman and his wife. They are dressed up the same way we would dress up for like family portraits. So it's just the two of them, and they're holding on to, I think, his paddle. So it's like I would see individual images of actual Ghana people, different types of Ghana people, as I put it, but not so much about them in practice. So let's say pouring libation or praying or sprinkling the quickly during Homowa or even the Wolome. right? So I didn't see much of that, especially in much older images. And it felt like maybe that was, let me just say, the lack of those images may have been proof of how much Christianity had been embraced or how much people were moving away from those. Or it could just be as simple as Asaaba not finding the pictures, you know what I mean? But but that's definitely what I noticed. And it was very interesting to see, you'd see names like Danish names, and you're like, oh, these are literally the ancestors of anyone with those names, and it's almost like you could see the roots of certain families, especially those who may be considered elite now. You see the beginnings and how the Ga identity kind of changed, but it didn't change entirely, but changed for certain families, and how they're now very linked to their European roots. There's some who are even trying to, I know my family, for example, were trying to figure out who our first Ga female ancestor was, so trying to
Oh,
like
that's so
literally get back.
interesting.
Yeah, I've been bucking my dad about it, but who knows? Who knows what progress they'll make, right? But but interesting things like that. So it's really showing how different or how diverse the Ga identity was and always has been.
Awesome. Like it's just very interesting that, of course, the
Yeah,
missionaries who are the primary people taking the pictures, of course, they'll want to
mm,
conceal certain cultural practices. And they probably want to like showcase what kind of propaganda or what kind of
yep,
image that they want to put out there, that they want people
exactly.
to subscribe to. So that's
Mhm.
interesting, but not surprising, right?
True.
Yeah,
Because that's how I felt. I was like, yeah, maybe they're hiding something, literally.
right. Yeah. So, we talked in the beginning of the interview about your work curating, like, I guess, a century old list or imagery of the kaba
Mhm.
and slit and the evolution of that. So, can you talk about that?
For sure. So, I'll be honest, let me put it out there. I did get some help from one of my historian friends. He's called Herman von Hesse. He's Ga. And he's, like I said, he's really into history. So got to learn about the influence of the missionaries and the Europeans on women's fashion and the kabasrotu. It really was an imitation of the European blouse, right? So, but even then, before missionaries, there were a lot of, the term he tends to use is Euro African. So it could be those of African women of or Africans of European descent who had already been wearing blouses and European dress, and then they started to adapt it to local fabrics. So you would see, as opposed to the usual dress that maybe the missionaries would have worn. You'd see on my Pinterest, for example, you'd see the very loose blouse with frills and the very loose skirt, which kind of mimicked it, but still kept it. They still created their own identity in that sense. And then you'd see these women of from like Cape Coast, Accra, who are already wearing European dress or fusing it with the more Gold Coaster styles of the time. And then, so that was their contribution to the kaba. And it honestly was a class thing, because non-Christian women along the coast, they went topless, right? And this is
Mhm.
something that you'd be amazed at how long people were topless for. Like, let's say through, I remember seeing an image of, I think it was a stamp or a postcard, I'm not too sure. It was a woman with her hair tied. You could, again, very conspicuously hidden hair, big braids underneath it. And she had a cloth for the lower part of her body. I think she had a very nice necklace on, gold, and she didn't have a blouse on. And this was probably from 1922.
Hmm.
So it actually continued for much longer than we would think, if we hadn't done any research or anything. So let's say even probably even as recent as the 30s, that quote unquote lower class women were not wearing tops. So the kaba really came to represent class and in some cases, the actual Christianity of it. So I remember from one of the images I shared, or two of them, I shared what we call the I think the fashionable fancy ladies back then, from the late 1800s. And then I shared an image of like women's fellowship women who had very, very similar style, almost identical, just much simpler. And it's I was like, oh wow, this was literally it's become like that style has literally represented Christianity for them,
Wow.
right? So it was almost identical. The same frilly. So even though like today they would wear a white, white blouse with the frills, and then let's say depending on the church, some of them might have patterned slits or very wide skirts, or in the image they were just wearing plain blue, and then they have the plain headscarf, right? So that in itself is very simple, and you immediately associate it with church duties and some kind of respectability and Christianity and things like that. And then, but the fancy bells were wearing theirs to be fashionable,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I found that very interesting, with the they have their jewelry and their necklaces and things like that. So as time went on, even from the 1920s, it was almost the same, very, very loose blouse with the long skirt. I see some from the 30s where, okay, they don't have much of a sleeve, but still very, very loose blouse. And then I started to see the change more of in the 50s, where you get the more cinch waist with the peplum style, and then you wear that with the slit. And of course, there was one I saw where it was almost like a tube kind of thing where it was sleeveless. I was like, okay, grandma. I don't know whose grandma that is, but she was very fashionable.
I
Um,
love that.
and and I was seeing that, I was like, okay, this is where things started to evolve a bit more. Even in I did see a few images from the 40s, and it was pretty much the same. Like, so for a good chunk of, let's say, late 1800s, very early to mid 19, let's say 20th century, it was a very, very loose kind of blouse, even though the arms and the upper part would kind of change a bit. And then things started to get a lot more modern in the 50s. I'm using modern loosely here, but in the 70s, it was very, simple. They had but I did see that some people tend to take more risk with their styles. I started to see more patterns, still not very adventurous. And then we hit the 80s with the very puffy sleeves and, the intricate patterns. That goes right down into the 90s. And then I saw some imagery even from the 90s where it was almost identical to what the fancy bells were wearing, right? Except that it became more linked to older women. So let's say something grandma would wear, because she's not wearing like something tight. She would just wear something very simple, add a little frill here and there, and then tie her into ma or mama around her waist on top of that. But and then they would still have the silk scarf. So it really showed how long that had survived. And even women today still wear it, but it's become just like everyday wear as opposed to something super fashionable or having to like maybe for occasions or things like that. So, and then of course we get into the 2000s where I mean, it is, well, I did see more, like a mixture of very simple styles where it's just, a nice little cute off shoulder, and then the fish style. I don't know if they still call it that, but the fish style of the skirt, the slit. And then of course we have the ones that they used to have on those calendars that the seamstresses would have, so the ones where they're much more intricate, but still, some kind of fish style. And then we come to the 2010s, 2020s, and oh my gosh, we're seeing
Yeah.
yeah, oh, you know what it
I'm
looks like,
excited to see how it's gonna evolve. But
you know,
yeah, like, and when you
yeah,
mentioned like, when you go to the seamstress well back in the day, and then they would
yep,
have these books or these
yep,
posters, and then you'd pick the style, and now you just kind of
exactly.
like show them an
Yeah,
Instagram image and you're like, oh, I want this, auntie, so
yeah, you know, yeah. And I'm really curious about how that's evolved. So, I mean, back in the day, would they just take the would they just take the cloth and say, okay, you know what to do? Because it was so common back then. And then
right.
now it's so customized, and everyone's really showing their individuality, even though there's it's still on trend, if I should put it that way. So it's like you have your own style, but at the same time, it's similar to what everyone else has out there. So it's kind of keeping you're still keeping in line with the style of the kaba and slit at the time,
Right.
right? And a lot of the European and African missionaries popularized like sewing and needlework. So, a lot of people were making their own clothes and becoming professional seamstresses and stuff. So that also, I would say, kind of, I don't know how much they influence the style, but that could have also contributed. Just them showing how to make certain things. That could have been like, okay, this is how we make it, and then before you notice, everyone is wearing a similar style, and then it becomes so normalized that this is how we have it today.
Yeah. And you know what struck me the most about what you said and in discussing the evolution of the kaba and slit
Mm.
is how closely linked it is to quote unquote Christian attire as
Yep.
mandated by the missionaries. I
Mm.
never knew that, like that was the
Yeah,
origin of the kaba and slit.
yeah.
Yeah,
It was.
that's so interesting. By interesting, I mean,
Oh, I
because
know.
it just shows how deeply embedded the colonialists and the missionaries are
Yep.
within every
Yep.
facet of our culture, including the
Exactly.
way that we dress.
You know? So it's because I remember like when I first heard about it, I was like, wait, are you kidding me? They influenced us that much. And then it made sense because it became like, okay, this is an upper covering, so a good Christian lady must cover up. So it all made sense. I was like, you know what? I get it. I get why it happened that way. Not too
Right.
happy about it, but hey, it's real life.
Yeah. And at least, obviously now we've made it into what it is today and we've
Yep.
changed some stuff up. So that's good in regards to
Yep.
that. But
Yeah, we made it ours.
interesting, the
Yeah.
origins of it.
I know, but I'm really glad that we made it ours.
Exactly,
Mm,
exactly.
over the years.
So, yeah, like what about our hairstyles? Again, you made this
Mm,
Twitter thread about the evolution of our hairstyles, and I was
yes.
living for it. I was like, oh my gosh, because
Yes.
several years ago, I was really
Mm,
trying to learn more about the types of hairstyles that we did back in the
mm.
day,
Oh
especially
yeah,
with our natural hair. So it was really
exactly.
cool to see this in your images that you curated. Can you walk me through that?
Sure, yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I only probably got as far back as like maybe 1860s. And many of them were really focused on the South. So that's really what I could find. I've seen various haircuts, of women. I have one with a lady with it looks like maybe the front part of her hair is shaved up to a point, which I found very interesting. I haven't quite figured out why, or if that was literally just a style, or if there was any significance to that. I see some version of, even Bantu knots, what we would call them, call Bantu knots now. And still on that era, so let's say 1860s, 1870s, I have the wife of, let's say, a missionary, so a Gold Coaster woman. So I see a middle part, and then the sides are a little bit puffy. So it's like almost like they're trying to tame the hair in a
Mhm.
sense, keep it all tucked away. So that's definitely what I noticed for those for that era. And then with the 1890s, so I guess these are the more fashionable women who were probably a bit more free, not so linked to the missionary work so much or to the church. So that's where it gets, oh my goodness, absolutely beautiful. So you have the updos where it's literally made up, and it's you can tell they had a lot of hair, and some of them had gold. Some of them just had it, let's say, tucked in, but then still with some kind of a headband, and the hair was still very visible. And there's some who would cover it completely, but you'd still see some of the hair peeking through, and you see that, you know what? No, they're hiding something very, very beautiful. And then I start to see a bit more change, let's say in the 1920s, 1930s, where the hair was very similar to what the flappers did. So let's say the women who lived, in the UK, US, like specifically white women, right? So they would have their hair in the short bob with a little cute curl on the side. So I saw that we had our own similar version where they would have the hair, but some of the hair kind of tucked away on the side in a little loop. So it's almost like, oh, that's an interesting way of, mimicking that, or little braids that were looped and then tucked into the side into the hats. So that was their way of doing that. I even have an image of someone who's tekwa, who still had the tekwa, so that still survived, right? And I know more modern tekwas, they would have they'll use some black thread to make it, and then so it became more, let me just say, synthetic, as opposed to using their actual hair and some kind of balm to put it up. We
Wait,
tend to do that
so for
differently.
the
Yeah.
tikwa before, you said
Yeah.
like it became more synthetic. So what were they
Yeah.
using before, if not the thread?
That's the thing. It was some kind of balm. So they would
Oh.
literally, yeah, they would literally have the person's real hair, and then they would shape it. And then, almost like the only thing I can compare it to is like maybe hair gel right
Uh-huh.
now, right? So that they would do that. So you'd literally see the hair, and then they would, put the gold in it and things like that. So that's one style of it that I would see. But the other ones were more, the earlier ones I was seeing were more braided. Others were just kind of maybe combed and put up. And then I'm starting to see more where they're, put together with, let me just use quote unquote the gel, or balm, where they put that together. But the actual tekwa that I knew of as a child was literally, they would braid, some people would braid around, and then they would have maybe some softer props in the middle, and then put the hair up, and then
Mhm.
tie around it to shape it, and then put the gold in. So it wasn't like the actual real hair that was being used. So I was actually amazed to see that, oh, there are older versions where they use their real hair. And then I see for like the 1940s, 1950s, you have like the side part with the hair kind of, let's say, big cornrows on the side. I don't know how else to describe it, but that was the style I did see more. So it was more like a single side parting. And then in the 50s, I see more of what we would call perming today, right? With the hair all
Okay.
relaxed and curly, and then some women would have their hair with the middle parting, but then possibly braided underneath, maybe like a single braid or two braids or something. But then they still have a silk headscarf. So you just see the middle parting peak a little bit, and then they cover the rest of the hair with the headscarf.
Oh,
So
I love that. It's a silk
you know,
hair scarf because that's what we're preached to do nowadays to keep our hair
yeah,
protected. So our
exactly.
grandmothers knew, they always knew.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So that was a big thing, because so there was even a point when I saw that I was like, this is the 1950s. Like it really had so much to do with that time. And then you come to the 60s, that's where the hair gets really, really conspicuous, where it's like, I am showing this off. I'm wearing the beehive, I'm wearing the braided bun. You have the wigs. So it's almost like, their version of the weave. And then the very ending of it, you're starting to see more of the afros. So it was very, very interesting. Like getting into the 70s, you'd see the afros. Some people still wore a different kind of, not a beehive per se, but still very let's just say very puffy kind of wigs, very big hair. So that
Mhm.
was the order of the day back then. Very, very big hair. And then you come down to 80s and 90s. Even the 90s, I'm seeing very, very similar, like I said, perming, like
Yes.
to the 50s. Yeah. So you have
Yeah.
someone with very curly hair and, not really split too much, but you can see it, and it's like, oh, it looks very similar to some of the 50s images I was seeing. You know how 90s hair was, the relaxed, some
Yes.
of the high low cuts, some just relaxed hair that's, a little wavy. Yeah, I tend to see more of that. And then the updos as well. Very, very interesting. Some with, let's say, some hair dangling on the side, just trying to add some some
Yeah, some
pizzazz to it. Oh God,
pizzazz.
that's a
I
terrible word.
remember I remember
I'm so old.
the there's this puff that
Yeah.
I used to do, or like that, I guess my
Hmm.
mom or whoever used to do for me when I would go to the salon. It
Yep.
was just kind of like, it's probably the late 90s, early 2000s, where I was a
Hmm.
child, but then it's like
Yeah.
you were
Yeah.
wearing
The
these
ponytails.
styles, these
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah. The
quote
flower
unquote
girl hair.
grown styles. You look like a little old lady or like a little woman
Yeah.
kind of thing. And then it's like
Yep.
this poofy like hairdo. And that was the style back in the
Exactly.
day. I was
Yeah.
feeling
The
myself.
you know, with the you know how the hair would be like folded into and it will be like a very
Yes,
high. Yep. Yep.
exactly.
Yep. I remember those ones. That was very 90s. And you see them with their kaba and slit. Oh, it was beautiful. And then the early
Yes.
2000s had their own version of that. But then we started to get the ponytails and the more, young Nollywood hairstyles that we would see with, more color and, more bobs, and yeah. So it's like you can literally see how much our hair changed, how much weave we used to wear, even different. Let me say different versions of weave. Because a lot of our grandmas and people were wearing those beehive wigs, and this was not with their hair, the actual
Mhm.
wigs, right?
Yeah.
So it was very interesting to see. And then of course now we have more of the Brazilian Peruvian hair and stuff like that. Still have our own like natural hair, but then it's still like still very very different. Like there's no, it's so unique to this era right now. Meanwhile I did see a bit of repetition back in the day, so it's very interesting to see how it all played out.
That is so cool. I love hair history.
Right.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see the way that our hairstyles evolve
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I guess how it speaks to the current climate of things and how
Yeah.
fun it is, how, it's just
Right.
sometimes it's just like it's not, our hair, black hair is often politicized, but
Yep.
then often sometimes it's like, it's not that deep. It's just we're playing with
Yeah.
our hair. We've always played with our hair and we're just doing cool, fun things and changing it up,
Yeah.
So
Just feeling beautiful,
exactly,
whatever your
exactly.
definition is of it. It's still, I mean, it was enough to just be like, you know what, I've done my hair, I feel amazing, I don't care what you
Yes.
say.
I
Yeah.
love that. I want to go circle to your 3D work and the
Okay,
beautiful 3D animation and 3D art that you're
okay.
doing and showcasing our fashions and hairstyles
Mhm.
within, the 60s, 70s, 80s. Can you
Yeah.
talk more about your 3D art and what your process is for that?
Okay, sure. So, I initially started out because a friend of mine, her name's Rochelle. Hi, Rochelle. And we'd always been interested in writing stories, and she was already doing a lot of 3D modeling, so she found this program and then taught me how to use that along with Photoshop. And to be very honest, I was just so the very first ones I did, at least with a historical backing to it. So I think I did like in the 1980s first. It was literally me just experimenting with actual props that I already had. So let's say, for example, I had like, let's say, a skirt suit, and then maybe a blouse with frills and stuff. So I'd like hide certain parts of the clothing, try to blend them together, and then put African print on them. Maybe manipulate certain hairstyle props that we already had. And so I was like, you know what? I just really wanted to do this for fun and just see how it came out. And I was really surprised at how well it worked out. Literally experimenting with props I already had and merging that with my interest in, our visual history over the years. And so it was purely by chance. And I just decided, oh, hey guys, look at what I've done. And then before I noticed, I'm doing like how many? I think what? I think I did them over 3 weeks. I did, let's say 1950s to modern times, like 2020s. So yeah, I got a tiny following, but it was really nice. I was like, oh, people are actually interested in this stuff. So yeah, it was really
Yes.
really fun. Yeah.
It was so cool because I think
Thank
what
you.
like really drew me, and I'm guessing what drew others as well, is just
Mhm.
seeing our fashions come to life in this kind of modern age. using modern technology, and it's 3D as well, because we don't often see it within this kind of medium. So seeing that, it was so cool. It was so cool. And I loved
Thank you.
it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was just a passion project, for fun. And I was like, you know what? Let me just try and put merge those two and see how this works out. And yeah, I'm really glad you all liked it.
Yeah. And that brings me
Mhm.
to your comics that
Yeah.
you produce with your, I guess, do you call it your company?
It's more like just, well, we're not a big company yet, but yeah, let's put it that way. Our little studio,
Your
our
studio.
digital studio. Yeah.
So I was on the Chimera Instagram page and I saw
Mhm.
that you've produced a couple of comic series on Instagram. And the one
Yeah.
that I was reading through is the one about the woman who goes to her father's hometown to learn about her
Mhm.
family history. And I
Yes.
was like, this is so cool because it's basically merging the art form, the 3D art a little bit with, in a
Exactly.
comic book sort of graphic novel fashion. And I'm such
Exactly.
a
Yeah.
nerd. Like
Yeah.
I love comics and graphic novels. I used to read a lot of those when,
Oh,
I
that's
was in
nice.
uni,
Yeah.
high school, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm living
Mhm.
for this. So can you tell
Oh yeah.
me about the comic and how you got started within, I guess, comics, graphic novels?
Okay, so it circles back to the same friend, Michelle, who's so amazing. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how the story itself even came to be. So on Facebook, there was a classmate, an old schoolmate of mine, who had a friend. You know how you can see stuff they comment on, even if you don't want to. And she was participating in these writers' prompts. So there was a friend of hers who's a writer and columnist called Nana Elikem, or at least that's the name he goes by. And so he would literally just start a sentence or put a phrase, and then we create our own stories. So I did a couple of those. And one of them, I started off with this character saying, I hate surprises. And then, before you notice, you're just writing and writing and writing. Before I knew, I had a whole story, and I decided to, no spoilers, but I decided to go in that particular direction because I was like, oh, okay. All right, let's see. Because I'm always interested in how someone would feel, trying to get to know a whole new person or someone who had never been part of their life but was still such a huge part of their life. In her case, this was her father, whom she had never met. And when it came to the visual part of things, we were just looking for different content to create. I mean, I'm always looking for an excuse to 3D model something and just have fun with it. So I think it was Michelle's idea to say, okay, let's do this story because we've done another one, which also was or did come from another writer's prompt. So we decided to do that one, created the imagery, and then created every single part. And then, she had taught me the Photoshop and things. So we made the backgrounds and everything. She was huge part of it, literally bringing this to life. And then my favorite part, to be honest, I created like a little mini family album
Yes, I
of
thought
the
that was
character.
so cute. I'm like, come on, attention to detail. I love it.
Thank you so much. Look, that was one of my favorite parts because I was like, you know what? What's a family without a family album, And I decided, okay, let's do something with the grandparents, let's do something with her aunties, let's do something, like, every single part of her life where maybe she would have missed out or had not been born, what was going on back then. And then, so of course, I went straight to Pinterest, Googled a little bit, trying to look at how I did find some videos, that the good old Brits had taken of their subjects. So, so I would see how they would dress, and I figured this was a very, you know, modern family at the time, so this is how they probably would have dressed, and things like that. Oh man, it was so much fun. I was like, okay, let me give Grandpa this suit. Let me give Grandma her huge hat and her gloves. So that was really really it was something I was like, you know what, let me really bring my love for history and family albums and just put that in there and really focus on her trying to find out so much about herself and really where she came from.
Yes. And
Yeah.
it came together so beautifully. I was like
Thank you.
standing I'm like, oh my God, like, how did I just find this out? Because I saw that it was posted several months ago and I'm like, oh my God, this
Oh
is
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, I didn't really scream it from the hills too much on Twitter, but yeah, on Instagram, oh gosh, I was constantly sharing it. I mean, I don't have too many followers, but I love the reception. I got so many followers from it, like on our page, Chimera. So I figured, hey, the people love it. Why not?
Yes, yes. And um I guess my final question for you before we wrap up is, you've talked about these things that you do, the curation work, the 3D artwork, and it's basically an interest of yours. It's a hobby, right?
Yeah.
So what is it like, approaching this as a hobby? Because I've been just consuming a lot of content about I recently listened to Tea with Queen and Jay. It's a
Okay.
podcast, amazing podcast. And
Mm,
I've also discussed this as well about the importance of having hobbies and not trying to monetize everything and keeping certain things
mm,
sacred. So, how do you
exactly.
see your work as you do as a hobby? How do you approach it?
My main approach is really just to do it when I feel like it. I'm not going by anyone's calendar or schedule. We're mostly doing it for ourselves in a sense. And when I say by ourselves for ourselves, it's stuff that we're interested in and stuff that we find beautiful and we're projecting or sharing, right? So it's not so much about being commissioned to do something, and that's where you tend, it's a recipe for disaster in the long run. Before you notice, you're doing stuff that maybe you're not so interested in because you have to satisfy people or do it for money or things like that. So it's like, look, there's so many people who tell me, oh, you should be doing this again, paid and stuff like that, and I'm like, okay, yeah, good idea, but deep down I'm like, no.
It's like, I don't want
Because
to. It's just for fun.
yeah, exactly, I want to keep it fun. I want to keep it and not just me, like, Rochelle too. I mean, eventually, if depending, we may
Mhm.
be able to do that, but right now it's really just, funny enough, part of my self-care. Even though some of these take so long, it's really, really fun and calming. And so I find that whenever I do too much at a time, then I take a long break because I'm like, okay, I'm constantly doing this, adjusting the nose, adjusting the skin, and so I'm like, no. When it starts to feel like work, I take a bit of time and then, kind of regroup and things like that. But that's really how I approach it. It's my happy place, and I really want to keep it that way.
Yes, I love that. I love that. So, is there anything you'd like to add that wasn't covered? Any final words?
Um, just kind of my inspiration behind all of this. Again, it's just, personal interest. So I am not so much of an expert in when it comes to the actual subject matter of how people actually lived and things like that, but it's just something that I felt was necessary, at least putting a face to our people, even showing how similar we are or how different things are. One thing that I found really interesting, I mean, it's a very small thing, but some images from the 70s where there were mothers who were like, and they were very clearly maybe over 40 or something, and they're wearing halter neck dresses, right? With the what we call show your back. And I'm like, now people do not respect that. But, this was very recent history. So you see the shift in how people became more conservative and things like that. And it just shows that things were really not perfect. They've never been perfect. They never will be perfect. We're just beautiful people adorning ourselves with what we have, sadly holding on to a lot of the what the Europeans brought to us, but still making things our own. And
Mhm.
we were very real people before. Now we are very real now. And I really, really wish we would document ourselves and each other more. And that's why I'm very happy when, anyone takes a selfie. It's like, this you're curating a bit of yourself. People can look
Exactly.
back and people will look back and say, oh yeah, this was my mom's cousin. Look at her having fun. And it really, really puts a face to so many people, and puts a face to the past, really. So yeah, those are my
Yes.
thoughts.
Yes, I love that. And, we have so many different technologies that we can use to
Mm,
document and curate our, I guess, our
definitely.
surroundings and all of that. So we will definitely leave lots of material for the generations to come. So yeah, that was
Exactly.
beautifully said. So how can listeners find you or support your work on the internet?
All right. Actually, I'll start with my Twitter. I scream a lot about everything on there, just a warning. So I'm at Asaaba, Asaabagh, Asaaba GH. And then our Instagram is instagram.com/ chimeraws. So that's QIMARAWS, and you can't miss it. The moment you see it, you'll see the some of our 3D art. The most recent ones I have up there are mostly body positive, and because my focus tends to change a lot. I mean, I'm human. And yeah, so that's mostly where we put up our art, and I mostly share on my Pinterest as well, which is pinterest.com/asabagh.
Really enjoyed this conversation with you and learning about our visual history in terms of the way we adorned ourselves, our hairstyles, and also your work as a 3D artist. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I love your work too, keeping track of everything digitally, and a lot of oral history. Keep up the amazing work.
Thank you. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this episode. So much cool stuff being shared, so much interesting things about our history in terms of fashion and style. Again, if you enjoyed this episode, something resonates with you, feel free to share this on social media, share in your text messages, WhatsApp, engage, comment. Let me know what you enjoyed about this episode, and follow asasebapod on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. So I'll be back in 2 weeks for the final episode of season 3. Yes, the final episode. But anyway, until next time, bye.